Hello and welcome to ATF TV. I'm Christine Zhou reporting from London. Today we are joined by Andrew Collier, who is the Managing Director of Orient Capital Research that specializes in macroeconomic research on China. Welcome to ATF TV, Andrew. Thanks for joining us from Hong Kong.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Andrew, let's start with Evergrande, China's most indebted company. As you know, Evergrande reported robust November sales, albeit at a lower average selling price, and has recently concluded a Hong Kong listing of Evergrande Property Services. Will these cash injections improve the company's liquidity stress, and can they placate its strategic investors?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, I'm not an equity analyst on Evergrande per se, so it's difficult for me to say whether they're going to survive. But I do look at the macroeconomic situation and whether they're getting support. They've definitely dropped prices quite significantly, and which is causing pressure on others in the market. And that's mainly to try to drum up sales. So it's no surprise that they've had an increase in sales. Some of their bond issuances have been relatively welcomed in the market because I think a lot of people do assume that the banks are going to continue to support Evergrande. I think that basically it's one of those devil's deals that's going to happen between probably the CBRC, which is the banking regulator, and the Evergrande, which is, okay, we'll let you survive. We'll wink, wink, nod, nod to the banks to continue to give you loans. However, you've got to reduce your debt quite drastically, which means essentially getting rid of a lot of assets and cutting your margins. Investors are not going to be happy with that. So the stock price of the companies may not do well going forward.
Many analysts have been predicting that early 2021 will see a pickup in China property refinancing needs, but most of these pickups will be from inferior quality companies. Will these pressure present fixed income investors a buying opportunity, or will they produce more protracted weaknesses due to increased bond supplies as issuers take advantage of low rates?
If I could answer that question accurately, I'd be a multimillionaire, but thank you for asking. Clearly, as we go into 2021, China's emerging from this COVID period, obviously a lot more rapidly than other countries around the world. The property sector is one of those things that never seems, it's the bubble that never pops. You know, it's been weak for some time. But because there's a whole fiscal element to all this that I think is overlooked, which is that local governments desperately need to keep land prices up in order to generate sufficient revenue to keep macroeconomic activity going and to pay the basic salaries of their people in provinces and towns across China. So it's in their vested interest to keep companies like Evergrande afloat. But meanwhile, there's pressure from on high, from Beijing, to try to avoid having a lot of heavily indebted developers that could really implode quite significantly. Evergrande only has 4.4% of the market. I believe the top 10 have something like 28%. So there's a lot of developers. So the systemic impact of a collapse of Evergrande would not be huge, but certainly it would send a bad message. So I think going into 2021, there may be a buying opportunity if the developers, such as Evergrande, are seen to be getting squeezed but not getting pushed out of business. And so far, it looks like the regulators are tapping the brakes, but they haven't put the car in park yet.
Beijing seems to be determined to keep restrictive housing pricing policies in place into 2021. And given that the credit environment will remain tight for developers, how will these impact the developers' business viabilities? And do you expect to see more consolidation and bankruptcies among the weaker developers?
Well, we've seen an increase in small business defaults. I think the number is something like 18,000 in 2019, up from like 15,000 the year before. So there's a whole wave of defaults occurring among SMEs across China. That's a fairly regularized process that's been organized by the courts because the government is very eager to try to regularize that. They don't want to keep supporting a lot of companies that shouldn't be supported. So going into 2021, there is the chance that the squeezing will be excessive, and all of a sudden there will be a wave of defaults that will affect the liquidity of the developers, or be a function of the liquidity of the developers. I don't expect it to be systemic in the sense of you're going to have 30 or 40 developers collapsing, but definitely you'll see some mergers. You're already seeing that in the state sector and some of the larger companies. And you're likely to see some companies, we're already seeing the wings being clipped on Evergrande because the government's basically saying, look, you're too big. You've got to cut back a lot on that. But as I said, they cannot squeeze the market too much because that could lead to the collapse of local governments, which is a big red line.
Recent comments from the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission that property in the biggest gray rhino seems to reflect the discomfort authorities have with regards to the financial risk posed by the sector. What's this real story here? Could it impact investors, and how are authorities equipped to tackle the risk?
Yeah, that was Guo Shuqing, is the head of the CBIRC, made that comment recently, and they've also, as you're probably going to ask at some point, they imposed the 3 red lines, forcing property developers to change their debt situation. This goes back to the point I'm making here, that there's basically a tension between what they call the people who spend money and the people who save money. The people who spend money are going to be the state council, because they want to prop up local governments in the provinces, and companies like the developers. The people who want to save money or stop expending excess money is going to be the regulators, like the CBIRC and the central bank, the PBOC, and because they're very concerned, they're responsible for the effectiveness of the economy, and they don't want to see an escalation of either our inflation, or more seriously, a bubble that pops and causes a huge problem like the United States had in 2008. So that tension is what we're seeing being played out here. And part of the job of the regulators like Guo Shuqing is to stand up and beat his chest and tell people that, God, you better watch out, otherwise we're going to squeeze you. And they did impose on top of that the 3 red lines, which are affecting debt to equity, debt to asset, and short-term cash positions, which apparently the developers are paying attention to. So some of this breastfeeding has been quite effective on the part of the regulators.
Speaking of the 3 red line, here's our 3 red line questions, which is what about the policy will be implemented in January 2021. Can you tell us a little and explain how this policy might impact the overall credit metrics of the sector, and therefore its influence on the broader economy?
Well, it's already affected the sector. They announced these last August, or in August. And nobody really knew exactly when they were going to be implemented. So all the developers got nervous. So some of the analysts have done the field work, and they've realized that a large number of developers, several dozen, have already cut back on their borrowing in order, because what happens if you cross all 3 red lines, you can't really borrow very much money, and if you cross 2 of them, you're limited on how much you can borrow. So they're very concerned about that, because they need access to credit in order to keep the whole property game going. So it's been quite effective so far, and I expect that it will be even more effective going into January, when the official launch date starts. What does it mean for the sector? Well, the CBIRC and the PBOC can withdraw. They can basically say, we're going to increase credit if they see too much pressure. 28% of all bank loans are going to the property sector, which is a huge area. And the bottom line for the Beijing is to make sure the banks don't collapse. That's the real scare here. So they have the ability to sort of go back and forth with their policies. The question in everybody's mind, as it always is in China, is what exactly is the point at which the 3 red lines will be crossed, and there'll be 6 red lines or 20 red lines. Who the heck knows at that point? So that's what the concern is. And so far, we're going to find out more in January, but so far there's been enough belief in the 3 red lines that the developers are paying attention.
Andrew, thank you very much for your time and insight today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity.
We hope to have you back with us again, and thank you all for watching. To read more on this topic, check out asiatimesfinancial.com for the world's best news on Asian markets, economies, and more. I'm Christine Zhou in London, reporting for ATF TV.